Hello and welcome back to Gender Studies. This chapter that we're going to cover is now gendered verbal communication. Here are 3 sentences from your textbook to give an example about how this verbal communication can impact gender and culture. So the first sentence is, the woman judge cast the deciding vote. Now, the point here is that we're highlighting, and that's a term we can put in brackets. Highlighting is a term where we highlight her sex, where it suggests that it's somewhat odd or in some way unusual for a woman to be a judge. The second sentence, Jason babysat his son while his wife was attending a meeting. Now that doesn't sound particularly peculiar for a lot of people. However, why do we refer to fathers who care for their children as not, why don't we say they're parenting? Why do we say they're babysitting? We don't say that, well, my wife's at home babysitting our children. So it seems to suggest men don't parent, when in fact, of course they do, and they are just as competent, can be. Number 3 question, or statement. Freshmen find it difficult to adjust to college life. Well, first of all, are all first-year students male? Having men at the end of freshmen suggests that that's the case. Now you might say, well, no, of course not. It includes everybody. However, it doesn't say everybody. And that's what this chapter is really about. And the next, and it's looking at, and it's related to the last, the one that will be following that, around some close relationships between the communication and gender issues. And so this is really important. So remember, use your textbook for further explanations and examples. I will be drawing your attention to it. So in terms of language, here's some things for us to keep in mind. Language is one of our most complex symbol systems. Now, what we mean is language is a symbol. Every letter in the alphabet is a symbol. We needed to learn what was that about. So symbols also allow us to define, organize, and evaluate phenomena, and to think hypothetically, and to think about self-reflection. So it's a much more complex in terms of language. We can use it to communicate to one another, but we can also communicate within ourselves, if you will. Symbols, or language, define phenomena, therefore language defines gender. And lastly, language reflects and reinforces the cultural view and values that inform us. And that's important for us to know too. So we're going to get started with verbal communication. Verbal communication expresses cultural views of gender, and we're going to look at 6 connections between language and gender. Your sentences that I gave you earlier only really highlight, if you will, a couple of them. So let's look at the first. Male generic language. Well, it excludes. It's a male generic language. It's like using freshman. You know, male generic language, chairman, mailman, mankind, he. It claims that it includes both, yet research studies have shown that people are associating male only with generic terms with much greater frequency than they associate the females with them. And so the language tends to be very male driven and almost female excluded. Because of the evidence provided by these studies, most dictionary and newspaper writing style manuals have policies requiring inclusive language and warning against using male generic language. Now, some universities and colleges and the Washington Post will now use the word individuals to refer to people rather than male or female. Now, the second issue we can look at in terms of language and culture. Language defines gender as binary. Now, binary just means, you know, there's a left and a right, or good and a bad. Women are frequently defined by appearance and by relationships with others, while men are more often defined by activities, accomplishments, and position. Language reflects social views of women as passive and men as more active. Now, for instance, phrases that suggest sexual activity imply that men are active and women are passive. Now you'll find some of these examples in your textbook, so please have a look. Language reflects the social views of women being defined by their relationships with others instead of being independent individuals. It's you and your sister, or you and your friends, it's how you are defined as opposed to you independently and individually. So for example, women who don't marry have often been referred to in negative terms. Women are traditionally expected to take their husband's name when they get married. However, there are more alternatives emerging. One alternative is that there are other options like hyphenating or creating a new name. Alternatively, some people will choose what is known as matriarchal, which is the term that sort of suggests or is meant to mean ruled by mothers. And it values women. So some people choose to rename themselves based on a matriarchal lineage. So language shapes awareness of what's important and helps us define realities. When something is named, when we label it, like sexual harassment, date rape, it's easier to recognize it, think about it, and stop it. So that's one of the values of language, is it helps us define things. Language is also changing. It's always changing. We shift our use of words to help create realities that are really important to us. People shape language, and language shapes people and culture. The fourth connection between gender and language is that language organizes perceptions of gender. A stereotype. It's a generalization about a group based on, and often limited to, information about some people who are a part of that group. Stereotypes overlook individual characteristics and differences. Women are often stereotyped as being overly emotional and weak, while men are tending to be stereotyped as rational and strong. Doesn't leave room for more variability in femininity and masculinity. It promotes, if you will, what is known as polarized thinking. Polarized thinking is looking at things as being complete opposites and distinctly different. So for example, assuming something is either right or wrong, a person is either male or female, masculine or feminine, there's no area in between. That's polarized thinking. In addition, the English language encourages polarized thinking by having very few words that indicate the fine levels of distinction in between the two polarized thoughts. Now, the queer performative theory challenges polarized language for sex, gender, and sexual orientation. There's no gray area, and therefore there's no room for someone who doesn't fit the two polarized points. So of course they don't agree with that. Now the fifth element about language and gender is language evaluates gender. Language reflects cultural values and is a powerful influence on our perception. So some examples of how it evaluates gender. Women are often referred to as somewhat immature or juvenile by use of words, things like girl and baby doll. Things like that are passing judgment on who women are, or equated with food, sweet thing, sugar, or animals, chick, and excuse me for saying, bitch. These are word uses that have meaning that judges people and gender. We might also have what we would label as diminutive suffixes. Diminutive suffixes designate women as in somewhat reduced forms from the male standard. You know, a majorette. The E-T-T-E at the end of major makes it juvenile. Women are often blamed with some language that men are celebrated for. If men go out and sow their wild oats, they're known as a stud. If a female does the same behavior, she might be labeled a slut. And that's language judging. And we use language in that way when it comes to gender. In addition, language in judging gender is pretty powerful. Female and feminine terms are often used to degrade boys and men. You might use the term sissy or mama's boy. Okay, and then there's a sixth connection between language and gender, is that language allows self-reflection. Because we use symbols to communicate, language shapes how we think of ourselves in addition to how we see the world around us. So there's meanings of language can change over time. For example, what was considered fat now, or what is considered fat now, may have been considered slim several decades ago. If the existing language is inadequate, we can move beyond it, such as through labeling ourselves as androgynous, as gender non-conforming. This nudges culture to recognize us on our own terms. And I think we can see in the last 10 years anyway, certainly inside the last 10 years, much of this nudging culture. So gendered styles of verbal communication. Let's look at what that might look like. Males tend to be socialized in more masculine ways, and females tend to be socialized in more feminine ways. Now, this isn't always the case. And it's important to remember that some people do not define themselves as male or female, masculine or feminine. Gender styles of communicating mean that girls can learn masculine modes of communicating and boys can learn feminine modes of communicating. Now, some people work to become fluent in both modes of communication. However, there are some general statements that we can make about feminine and masculine gendered communication. And we'll look at a few. The first that we'll touch on is that gendered speech communities. Now, that may not be something that you're familiar with, but a speech community is a group of people who have a common understanding of communication goals, how to reach those goals, and interpretation of communication. Males and females tend to be socialized into a masculine and feminine speech communities. And they do this often through games. Certainly as children, that's what games are, one of the functions of games. These gendered speech communities share communication practices and often underlie common misunderstandings and misinterpretations between members of different speech communities, the male and the female. Secondly, another relationship here is lessons of children's play. Researchers have drawn connections between the ways children play and how they communicate. Now, this pattern seems to develop since children tend to play in sex-segregated groups. Boys play with boys, girls play with girls. And they play different kinds of games based on those groups. Now, we know that that's not always the case. There are times when boys and girls play together. But remember, we're talking about research-based examples, and we may not be aware of the larger population entirely. So this data is representative of a larger population, not our individual experiences. So if we look at some of these differences, like for example, boys' games are often played in large groups, they're more competitive, and they have clear goals, including some roughhousing, and they have distinct roles and rules. Structured by these goals and roles, they are limited. There is limited need to discuss how to play. You just start playing. Boys' games cultivate 4 communication rules. The first rule: use communication to assert ideas, opinions, and identity. So males use their communication, their language, as a way of sharing ideas, expressing opinions, and telling people who they are in relationship to what we're dealing with here. The second is that males, or the male masculine speech community, uses communication to achieve specific goals. How are we going to do this? Then we use dialogue for that purpose. And 3, the use of communication to attract and maintain others' attention. We may, and I've been in groups like this, and maybe you have as well, that the volume starts to increase to get everybody to say what they think they need to be heard more. So there's that, communicating to get attention. And then fourthly, the fourth rule is use communication to compete for attention of others. Now girls, they too have a style. And girls' games are often played smaller groups over pairs and often do not clear rules or roles. Players must talk to work out the rules. Talk is about the key part of playing. And for instance, girls often play house or play school, and there's not exactly rules about it. They emphasize four main aspects of communication that cultivate these interpersonal relationships. So let's look at the rules for the female communication speech communities. First, use communication to create and sustain relationships. It's important to note before I go much further, these are all socially constructed. So this is what we teach boys and girls and what we end up learning as women and men. The second rule for female speech communities is use communication to establish egalitarian relations. So it's about balance, fairness, equal. That's egalitarian as opposed to patriarchal, male-led, or matriarchal, female-led. The third rule, use communication to include others. And so you look for feedback from others. You ask, are you okay? Is everything fine? So you use communication to include everyone. And the fourth rule, use communication to show sensitivity to others and relationships. Now the size of girls' groups foster pro-social cooperative play while boys' groups encourage competition. Now many girls today play competitive sports and learn the rules of masculine speech communities, and this is consistent with Standpoint's theories premise that subordinate groups are motivated to learn the standpoint of the dominant groups. Another area that we can look at here is gendered communication practices. The feminine speech communities view communication as a tool for establishing and sustaining interpersonal relationships. Communication in the feminine speech community includes fostering these connections and relationships. Secondly, equalizing the status to establish more of that equality that they strive for. 3, show support for others using empathy. And 4, we would does conventional maintenance work. So it's called meta-communication in psychology. So maintenance work is where you work on your communication. It's working with others on the conversation and being more thorough in your investigation of it. 5, demonstrates responsiveness. That's one of the rules there. And then 6, shares personal information. That's important in the female speech communities, and disclose personal, disclosures. It's like saying things to the only 1 or 2 really people that you trust. You don't say personal information to people that you don't know. And then there's also, it's often tentative. A lot of the language used by the feminine speech communities are tentative. That is, using verbal hedges and tag questions. Now, there are controversies surrounding this, and there's a researcher by the name of Robin Lakoff. His argument is that hedges make women's speech powerless by indicating the lack of confidence. However, Lakoff's argument relies on using masculine speech as the standard, interpreting feminine speech through a masculine lens, and that, of course, can be problematic. Masculine speech communities view communication as a way to establish goals, exert control, preserve independence, and entertain and enhance status. Communication in masculine speech communities include establishing a status and control. Now, this is done through asserting ideas and authority and disclosing less than women. Secondly, it's used to accomplish instrumental objectives. The use of face-to-face communication or computer-mediated communication to accomplish instrumental objectives. Men want to show their knowledge to others and solve problems. Now, language also for masculine speech communities gains and maintains conversational command. Now, one of the techniques to gain or maintain conversational command is interrupting. And interruption is one characteristic of this. While both genders, male and female, interrupt, it's the masculine communicators that tend to do so more frequently. Masculine and feminine communicators also differ in their reasons for interrupting. Masculine communicators interrupt to take control of the conversation, while feminine communicators interrupt to indicate interest and respond to others. Also, we can look in terms of the masculine speech community is direct and assertive, is often abstract. It just means it isn't precise. It can create barriers to intimacy as a result. It also includes a minimal response cues. The minimum response cues, these are the verbal cues that one is showing or saying that demonstrates you're paying attention to, rather than anything you might say, yes, I agree with that. You might go, uh-huh. And that uh-huh are the minimal response cues. Now, the last little bit we wanted to sort of touch on is the gender-linked language effect. Gender-linked language effect notes that language difference between men and women are affected by a number of factors. This can include whatever topic they're talking about, your speaker status, conversational partners, who else is involved, and the significance of gender to the conversation. Now, women tend to speak more tentatively on masculine topics. Of course they would, they are not masculine, right? But men speak more tentatively than women on feminine projects or topics. Gender expression varies according to the context and other factors. Gender-based misunderstandings in communication are common. When we get together, our speech communities and the differences can contribute to the misunderstandings. Now, we're going to consider 5 types of these misunderstandings. And I'll start with showing support for people who are feminine communicators often want to talk about a problem while masculine communicators want to solve it. This can often leave both communicators feeling unsupported. Showing sympathy can be interpreted as condescending and by masculine communicators, but is seen as a way of showing support by feminine communicators. The second area of misunderstandings is what's known as trouble talks. Now, this is where we can say masculine communicators tend to show respect by assuming others don't need sympathy. But in feminine speech communities, this seems to dismiss somebody's feelings. By asking what's wrong in a masculine speech community, you're imposing and pushing to expose some vulnerability in the recipient of your question. But not disclosing, someone from a feminine speech community could feel shut out. So you can see where we would have conflict. Feminine speech communities relate by matching experiences, but male speech communities, this could feel like an attempt to steal attention and focus the conversation elsewhere. A third type of misunderstanding is the point of the story. Masculine communicators tend to tell a story in a very linear, chronological way, while feminine communicators tend to tell stories in a less structured format. Masculine communicators often feel that the feminine communicators fail to move quickly to the point of the story. And feminine communicators often feel that masculine communicators don't include important relationship level details. Relationship level. That brings us to the fourth, relationship talk. Masculine communicators tend to talk about the relationship only when there's a problem. We got to solve the problem then. That's the reason to talk. Feminine communicators, well, they tend to want to regularly check in about the state of the relationship. Masculine speech communities view communication as a means to doing things and solving problems, whereas the feminine speech communities regard the process of communication as a primary way to create and sustain relationships. It's not surprising we have misunderstandings. The fifth is public speaking. And now this takes a turn in a slightly different direction. A masculine speaking style is generally the standard for public speaking. Women in politics have to manage a fine balance in which they are sufficiently female and sufficiently masculine. When partners understand how to interpret each other's rules, they are less likely to misread motives. Greater fluidity and fluency in gendered communication norms can empower us to become more gratifying conversational partners. I really hope this is giving you some insight into the complexity of language and communication, but how it relates to gender and to culture. So going forward, we will keep on the same tack. So I hope you're enjoying yourself. I hope you're doing well, and we'll see you next week. Bye now.